St. George. On behalf of Father Andrew, the rector, and the wider church, it's an honor to welcome the Carver project here tonight and this faculty forum. After the conversation, there is a reception in the Great Hall. But with what's going on in the world at the moment in the Middle East, may I pray. Almighty God, we pray for the people of Israel, Gaza, and the West Bank. We pray for the future of the Holy Land. We pray for those who will weep and live in fear and die tonight. Lord God, we pray by your great mercy, defend your children from all perils and dangers this night. We ask this all in Jesus' name. Amen.
Good evening. I'm Shelley Milligan. I'm the managing director of the Carver project, and we are delighted that you're here tonight to inaugurate a new event for us, the Carver Project Faculty Forum. And I'll tell you a little bit about that in just one second, but I want to make sure that we thank the Church of St. Michael and St. George. It's gorgeous here, and Lori, Marty, Tom, you have been such gracious and hospitable hosts, so thanks for welcoming us, and especially on short notice. The Carver Project's mission is to empower Christian faculty and students to serve and connect university, church, and society. We've been around for about 5 years, and part of what we like to do is have events that are open to the public at different churches so that we can be with one another as Christian brothers and sisters, as the body of Christ, and hearing from wonderful speakers, either Christian intellectuals or Christians from other universities. And as we were planning, we realized we have such a wealth of our own faculty who are so gifted that we want to share with the community. So that really brings us to tonight's event. And this faculty forum is designed to introduce you to one of our faculty, and so we're excited to have that happen here tonight. I just want to give a quick housekeeping note. On your program, there is a QR code, and the purpose of that is for you to ask questions. So if you scan this with your photo app or your photo on your phone, it'll take you to a URL, and just push that, and then you'll be able to type in a question. We'll be monitoring those and ask our panelists the questions after the initial period of interview with Abram. And please do stay after the session tonight. We have some cookies, lots of good cookies, and some water and lemonade. So I hope you'll stay with us after. We are pretty informal at the Carver Project. We really enjoy being together, so the introduction tonight is short. There are two people that you need to know. One is Abram Van Engen. He is the Carver Project's executive director. He's been our executive director for almost 2 years now and has been involved with the Carver Project since its inception. He is the Stanley Elkin Professor at Washington University. He chairs the English department and has research interests in Puritans and poetry, among other things that he may talk about briefly. And then his colleague is Gerald Early, whom we're so excited to have as part of the Carver Project. Both Abram and Gerald are faculty fellows, as are some people here. In fact, if you're a faculty fellow of the Carver Project, would you just stand really quickly? I know there are at least 4 or 5 of you. Yes, great. Yeah, apparently the guys made it tonight. Okay, glad you're here. So Gerald is, I very much feel like he's one of the most distinguished faculty on Washington University's campus, and you can read about him here. Perhaps what's not there is what's really important to Gerald, his family. And I remember he couldn't make one of our last dinners because he was taking his grandsons to the Cardinals game. So he is a family guy, and we're so glad to have Ida here as well, Gerald's wife. So Without further ado, I'll bring Abram and Gerald up and have a good conversation.
Time, by the way. You got that?
Hello?
We did not mic test this ahead of time, so my apologies. You got it? Right here. You got it. So, that's a little loud. We'll just slide that down. All right. So welcome, everybody. This is informal, as you can tell. We like to do things informally. We're an intimate sort of community. And I just give you two reasons for doing what we're doing tonight with the rest of you. So one is that for the last 5 years, the Carver Project has met. And one of the things that has developed out of the Carver Project, and which we've been doing for several years now, is that the faculty get together once a month for a dinner. And at that dinner, a faculty member will present their research to the rest of the faculty at the Carver Project. And it's been amazing. Like, I've learned so many things about so many different parts of the university. One night we had a guy who was a pediatric heart surgeon explain going through a 13-hour surgery on a 2-day-old baby. These are not things that I normally talk about with my colleagues in the English department. So understanding the different operations of the university and what all is going on there has been pretty amazing. And we just had the idea, like, well, why don't we just do this for the community? Why don't we begin doing this for a broader community than just ourselves? And so in a way, what this is just a regular faculty dinner, except with other people invited too. The other reason for this is that I just wanted to talk to Gerald, and I came up with a pretty elaborate way to do it. So I've invited him to my sanctuary where I go to church, and I was like, let's talk. Let's talk about your work, Gerald. So I was delighted.
Why didn't you invite me to lunch?
I was delighted that he said, yes, my son's confirmation teacher's here in the front row, so we're just going to score him some points tonight, hopefully. All right. So anyway, I want to have a conversation, and there's 3 big buckets of basically topics that I wanted to talk about tonight. And one was basically the kind of writing career that you have had and some of the topics that you've talked about. A second is some of the more recent writing you've done and thoughts on the sort of present state of American culture. And the third is just the way that faith and religion has informed what you've done over the years. So to begin with thinking about your career as a writer, you've written many things.
Yeah, that's true.
For many years,
Yes.
a few. And I just wonder if you could say a word about how you began as a writer. How did you know you wanted to be a writer? What got you started?
Well, I was living with my sister in San Francisco after I graduated from high school. Can you folks hear me?
I think, can we move it closer?
Okay. Okay, is this any better? No?
Can you move it to the other side?
Okay.
Remember, informal.
Okay, is this any better? This is better. Okay. So I started out, after I graduated from high school, my sister was living in San Francisco, and I went to live with my sister for about a year in San Francisco. My sister had been in an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, and she had gotten married, and then the marriage broke up, and so she was living in San Francisco, and she had just had a child. And she was going to San Francisco State College, it was called at that time, not university. And she was an English major, and so I was out there living with her. I was not the world's greatest student in high school. I mean, I was a pretty indifferent student. And my sister decided to embark on a project of civilizing me, or giving me culture or something. So she took me to her classes, and I started reading the books that she had in her house. And in this way, I got to read Blake's Songs of Innocence and Experience, and I read The Great Gatsby, and I read novels by Thomas Wolfe, and I read a novel by William Faulkner, and I was reading all this stuff. and I discovered that I kind of liked this stuff. But the thing that really got me interested in wanting to be a writer was I read these essays by James Baldwin in a book called Notes of a Native Son. And I just found it extraordinary. I just thought the writing was just extraordinary. And I said to myself, I would like to write essays. I would like to do what this guy is doing. I would like to write essays. I never felt that way about the novels I was reading. I mean, I enjoyed the novels, but I never said, oh, I'd like to write novels. I got the idea I wanted to write essays, and so I started messing around. And then when I went to college, I got into writing for my school newspaper, and they made me a columnist. And Ida remembers that I was a very controversial person. I wrote things that upset a lot of people. I think sometimes I did that on purpose. But for me, it was just practicing writing essays. And once I got to that point, that was something I just knew I wanted to do. The only problem was trying to figure out how to make a living doing that. That was the only problem. But wanting to do that, the desire was there to want to do that and to want to use an essay in a very creative way.
Well, in an essay you wrote that came out about a year ago, there's a little detail in that essay about this time in your life that you left out of that story, which is that you're, and I think this might be of curious note to people, you're actually first a college dropout.
Yeah. When I got out of high school, I was admitted to Antioch College. You heard that school in Yellow Springs, Ohio? So I went there, I was there for like 2 weeks. And I said, man, I don't like this place. I don't like Yellow Springs. I'm in the middle of nowhere, and I had to get out of there. I had to really get out. So that's when I went to San Francisco, because I didn't want to go back home because my mom would be upset with me for leaving the school. So I got in touch with my sister, and she told me to come see her in San Francisco. And when I got to San Francisco, I said, oh, I like this much better.
So you began as a kind of autodidact. You taught yourself with reading the books that your sister gave you or sister had around.
Yeah. And then also the environment, too, because my sister was hanging around a lot of people who had been in the Civil Rights Movement, because she had been a SNCC. So a lot of people in San Francisco she was hanging around with were in the Civil Rights Movement, were ex-SNCC people, or they were in the Nation of Islam, or they were Black Panthers or something like that. So I was hanging around all these people who weren't too much older than I was, but it was exciting. It was actually exhilarating. I was like 17 years old. I'm around these. It was exhilarating. I thought it was great. I said, man, I hope I never get any older than 17. That year was great. It opened me up to a lot of things, and I would say that year was pivotal in my becoming a writer.
There's one other book that you mentioned about this year. So just to paint the scene for you a little bit more, put too fine a point on it, it's 1969 in San Francisco.
That's right, 1969.
And you write that one of the books your sister gave you that became rather pivotal for you was actually Henry David Thoreau's book, Walden.
That's right.
So in your essay about Walden, you write, I think Walden profited me more than any other book I had read in my young life because of the time, the place, the circumstances, and my particular need for what I thought and hoped that it said. So I'm just kind of curious what you thought and hoped it said, and do you still think it actually says that?
I had to reread Walden when I wrote that essay, which I think came out a year or two ago. When I first read Walden, I just found it an amazing book because it was about an experience I really didn't know at all. I really didn't know anything about nature. I wasn't particularly interested in nature. I wasn't a nature kind of person. I was a very urban person. And I didn't know anything about transcendentalism. I didn't know anything about Unitarianism. I didn't know anything about Emerson. I didn't know anything about any of that stuff. But what I discovered was that I didn't need to know anything about any of that stuff for this book to really affect me. I just liked the way it was written. I liked his attitude. I liked the kind of, I thought there was, especially when I reread it, I thought there was a certain amount of snark in the book. And I liked that. And I liked it when I was young, too, except I didn't realize it was snark, but I liked it when, I liked the attitude of it. And I read other things by Thoreau at that time in San Francisco, civil disobedience and all that. And, he was an abolitionist and all that. That was cool. And so what I felt about Walden then and now was that it was a book that I thought about as someone really looking at nature and at life and trying to really understand it on its own terms and to also try to not impose too much of himself on it. I really thought that I was very affected by the book in that way and how it was written. And the search in the prose for a certain kind of clarity. And I thought to myself, yeah, I would like to do that. I would like to be able to achieve that kind of level of clarity in the writing. And I thought the book was also quite religious in its own way. But it was religious in a way that it was preaching, but it wasn't preaching in the way that I was used to people preaching. And so I found that what he was doing insofar as instructing people, because I found it to be a very instructive kind of book, that how he was instructing people I thought was very exhilarating and very lively and very, I thought he had a very teacherly kind of way about what he was doing that was very enriching for me. I thought he was a terrific, I think of the reason why I think I was so moved by the book and it so affected me, because I thought he was such a great teacher. I thought he was probably, at the time, a book that I thought was one of the best teachers I had read was Thoreau and Walden. I just thought he was a terrific teacher.
I teach pieces of Walden every year, and I think one of the interesting ways to track how student culture is developing is to just basically use Walden as a litmus test, because in the 60s and 70s, I mean, Walden was huge.
Yeah, it was
people
huge.
Loved, and these days, if you try to teach Walden, most students push back and say, "Man, this guy needs to get a job." And
oh, that's too bad. Well, it was big in in the late 60s. Walden was the book.
Yeah.
I mean, Walden
it is
was
not
the
the book these days.
Yeah,
and the students don't get the humor of it. He's very funny.
Yeah, he is very funny.
He talks about being on a vegetarian diet, and he says, this farmer says to me, "You can't be on a vegetarian diet. How will you have any strength in your bones?" And he says, "The farmer tells me to this while oxen who eat only grass are pulling him along." So he's constantly sort of pointing out the ironies of life throughout the book. But my students sort of just find this guy weird, and they think he's not on a very good career trajectory.
Yeah, he made pencils.
Maybe Walden is one place to think about the art of the essay, because I think of Thoreau as a particularly fine artist of the essay, and each of the chapters of Walden is like an essay unto itself. And I had a couple questions about you. So you're primarily an essayist.
Yes.
I did find a book of poems that you wrote.
But the poems were
amazing.
The poems were meant to be. The poems weren't meant to be poems for real, because I don't consider myself a poet. They weren't meant to be poems. They were meant to be, I wrote these poems because I said, I want to write essays. And so I can't keep up with the subjects I want to write essays about. So I'm going to write a poem, and it's going to be like a kind of shorthand. And then I'm going to get back to it, and I'm going to make an essay out of this. But the poems were just like art book sketches. They weren't for real. And then, this guy took them all and put them in a book. But I said, they aren't for real. I mean, they're it's like taking an artist's sketches and, they're not for real. And everything. But, I remember Carl Phillips told me he liked them, and I was impressed. I said, gee, you're a for real poet. I mean,
Yeah, right.
I was impressed.
Yeah, yeah. So I wanted to get your sense on the art of the essay as an art form, in and of itself. So for the audience, a lot of people trace the art form of the essay back to Montaigne.
Yeah,
as
sure,
sort of the
sure.
original artist of the essay in the 1500s, Montaigne. And his book is called Essays.
Right.
And of course, it just means, in French, attempts.
Right, exactly.
That's what they are. They're attempts. But from Montaigne, then, over the last 500 years, this whole art form of the essay has developed. And I just wonder how you would define what the artistry of an essay it really is. I mean, we have these conversations about poetry all the time. We have these conversations about novels all the time. But the essay really is its own art form. And I just wonder if you think through what makes it an art form, and how do you know when it succeeds?
I think what I like about the essay is that it's very elastic. You can do a lot of different kind of things with it. You can write a personal essay. You can write something that's very journalistic. You can write something that's almost academic. And during the course of my career, I've kind of done all those things at various times. Sometimes I've tried to do them in one essay, and that doesn't always work. But I don't lack ambition when it comes to writing an essay. But I think of it as constructing a voice and finding a subject. First, you have to find a subject that you can write about, and that you can write about, and you think someone wants to hear what you have to say about it. And so that's the part of finding a voice. And so you have to, and every time I write an essay, I have to find a voice to be able to convey the subject. And if I do it right, I should be able to interest you in that subject. But essays are trying. I mean, I always look at an essay as an attempt, and I don't worry too much about whether an essay works well or not. I mean, you do your best you can, but there's always the next essay. So I don't worry about it. If that essay doesn't work, right, I'll just write another one. And I don't even worry about whether I'm being consistent in my point of view in an essay if I'm writing on the same subject a lot.
Large, that contain multitudes.
Exactly, so it's I said, okay, fine, I said this in this essay about this subject, and so I'll say something a little different in this one, because at this time I'm thinking about it a little bit differently or something like that. Then the other thing I find out is, one of the reasons I really like writing, because I don't know what I think until I write. I mean, you think you know what you're thinking, but you really don't know what you're thinking until you write. Because then when you start writing, you're actually putting it down and expressing it, and then you say, oh, this is what I think. Oh, I didn't know I thought this. And writing is very opening for me in that way about it as a function of thinking. So one of the reasons I like to write essays a lot, because I like to find out what I'm thinking.
Yeah. I want to read 2 sentences that you wrote about the essay as an art form. This is from Tuxedo Junction, which is
sure
one
it's
of
going
your...
to sound better than what I just said.
Tuxedo Junction is one of Gerald's first books. It's a great book of essays that you should all check out. But in there, in the introduction, you've put together a book of essays, and you write an introduction about the essay. And this is what you say: an essay has nothing but its sheer insistence that the writer knows how to write well enough to make you read something that could attempt to be anything and threatens at any moment to be nothing at all. And then you add that essays...
Boy, I wrote that sentence.
Yeah,
wow,
you did write that.
Right.
Now you think
I was smarter then.
And you say, essays are finally prose, the common language, stating with clarity and consciousness, and I love this line, the startlingly human triumph of forthright conviction, without story as its aim. The startlingly human triumph of forthright conviction. And I think when I read a bunch of your essays preparing for this, I read your work before, coming to WashU, and I think if there's one through line that I find in a lot of your work, it's that you, first of all, are startled by the human triumph of having convictions that are clearly held, and that these convictions could differ from one group to another. And I think there's a way in which your work just finds it sort of admirable and interesting, rather than waging war for a particular conviction, you're more interested in the actual convictions that people hold and why they hold them.
Yeah, I say that's true, you know, and I guess, that interests me about people is not whether the convictions they hold are good or bad necessarily, but why they hold them and what it means to them that they hold these particular convictions. I remember a young black student had read a couple of essays of mine. He came up to me and said, you know, your essays make me feel uneasy. And I said, well, why is that? He said, because you make being black this kind of probing sort of thing. And I don't like that probing aspect in your work. And I said, oh, well, I guess you can't please everybody. But I said, that's sort of what I'm trying to get at. And he said, that's not what I need right now. But I respected him for saying that, and I respected him for understanding, even though he didn't like it. He kind of understood what I was trying to do. Yeah. So I was impressed with that. I mean, I was impressed he was that attentive a reader, even though he didn't like it. Of course, my feelings were slightly hurt that he didn't like it. But I appreciated the fact that he was that attentive a reader, and an attentive reader, even if they don't like you, as a writer, you're just really appreciative of somebody being attentive to what you're writing, whether they like it or not.
Yeah. You've written about so many things, boxing and baseball, some great essays on beauty pageants, which everybody should read, mystery novels, crime novels, classic novels, movies, and a whole lot more. And in writing about all of this stuff, one of the things you say is that you describe yourself as a cultural critic. Mm-hmm. And in the Culture of Bruising, which is the book that won the National Book Critics Circle Award, you say, I do not wish to subvert anything. I wish to engage. Yeah. And you go on and say that you want to be a critic in the truest and most old-fashioned sense of that term. Yeah. So I wonder if you could just say, what is the truest and most old-fashioned sense of the term critic?
I think to be able to look at something, to look at an event, to look at the world around you, people, event, whatever, and be able to try to apply as much intelligence as you can to what you're looking at and describing it and offering it to people as honestly as you can. I feel it's very important to be an honest writer. The one thing that really impressed me, for instance, about when I was a teenager, I read James Baldwin's Notes of a Native Son. So at the beginning of the book, he has a section called Autobiographical Notes. And he ends that with this sentence, I want to be a good man and an honest writer. And I said, oh, that's me, man. I mean, that became my motto, is I wanted to do that. And so I really try to, that's what I really think a critic is about. And I came to English literature because I thought a little bit about being a historian. I was majoring in history when I was in undergrad school. I went to literature because I liked the act of criticism. I thought it was vital in understanding the world. I thought it was a vital kind of thing for people to do. I thought it was part of what made people human was to generate criticism. Mm-hmm. I thought criticism can be a healthy thing. So, I mean, sometimes it's not healthy, but I think criticism can be a healthy thing. And when I got to grad school, I was very much impressed with, I was in grad school, they were still reading, American Renaissance by F.O. Matheson and Supernaturalism and those books, which I'm sure nobody reads anymore. But those were books that I grew up with. And I really liked Leslie Fiedler, and I really liked the kind of thing that he did. And I really liked Ralph Ellison's essays in Shadow and Act. And I said, okay, the kind of literary critic I want to be is something like that. But then I also discovered that because I was in African American studies, or because I wound up in African Americans, it wasn't a plan necessary for me to be an African. It wound up that way. I found out that I had to learn how to talk about African American culture more widely than just literature. because there were very many important things to talk about in African and African American culture that I felt that people needed me to write about other than just writing about literature.
You say in one of your essays that your mother was very proud of you for becoming a professor, but she never introduced you as a professor of African American studies.
No, she
or
didn't.
African American. She always introduced you as a professor of English.
Yeah, she did.
Can you say why?
My mother felt that my going into African and African American studies was I don't know, a little bit of a cop-out or something. She said, it never really quite impressed her the way being an English person, being in English did, because she thought I was breaking down some kind of barrier being in English. But she didn't think I was really breaking down anything being an African American study. As she said, I think she felt, oh, that's a black person looking at black people, of course. But I think she felt that my being in English, my presence was important there. And that I was making a kind of a mark there. It wasn't that, and I don't want you to get me wrong, it wasn't that my mother didn't like blacks. My mother was a very racial person. I mean, my mother was a super duper, my mother was a super duper racial person. I mean, she was a race woman. I mean, she was really all for the race and all that kind of stuff. So I don't want you to get the impression that she was, wishy-washy about racial issues or something. She was, in many respects, very militant about many racial things. But she also came up at a certain time when she thought that pushing against something was important. And I think she kind of felt that my being in black studies was not the way to break down barriers and push things forward in the way that my being in the English department. So that's why she said that about being in English.
I want to read a Baldwin quote here that you use as an epitaph in one of your books, and I just want to use it to pivot to some of the recent writing that you've been doing. So this is a quote from James Baldwin, and actually you use this there's a recent essay about a year ago that you wrote in Hedgehog Review that just won a big award about identity and authenticity in African American culture. And you start off with this quote from Baldwin, which says, "It is really quite impossible to be affirmative about anything which one refuses to question." And I want to use that to think about some of the approach that you take to a lot of subjects. You end up in a lot of territory that some people might avoid.
Yeah, sure.
And I think what you do in that territory is find what to affirm and what to question. And one territory where you've recently ended up is in the territory of black conservatives. So you said you are not a Republican, and I think in one essay you said, "I don't identify as a conservative," which is an interesting way to put it. But nonetheless, you teach a class on black conservatives and black conservative traditions. And then you recently found yourself at a black conservative conference having several meals with Clarence Thomas.
Yeah.
And writing about it. So I just wonder if you want to, what is it about, so you now have 3, 4, 5 recent essays about black conservatives in America. What is it you want people to know about black conservatives in America?
Well, first of all, the course I teach on black conservatism in America is in the African American Studies Department. And I went to Shanti Parikh, who is the director of the chair now, because it's a department. And I said, "Shanti, I want to teach this course on black conservatism. But if you don't want me to do this, or you don't think this is good for the department, I won't do it. In this department." But I would prefer to do it in this department. And because I'm interested in looking at various kinds of black people, and I think it would be interesting to do this course, and I would prefer to do it in this department because I think it would say something important to do it in this department. And she said, "Oh, yeah, it's fine. You can do it." It was so easy. I couldn't believe it. It was so easy. But she said, "Yeah, I don't have any problem with that." So that's how the course developed. I had been thinking about it for a long time. Because to me, there were a couple of things. One was that the students could hear so much about black Marxism, and I've taught a lot of black Marxist books, and I've heard a lot of black Marxist speakers, and I understand that there is a ideological undergirding of Marxism with African-American studies. I have no problem with that. I get it. I know why it's there, and I know why it's important that it's there. But I wanted the students to hear something else. I wanted the students to hear, okay, here are some people who are not Marxists and who have an entirely different view, and I think it can be helpful to you to read it. Not to read it to be converted. I mean, if I was teaching a course on Marxism or a course on Christianity, the point wouldn't be to try to convert you. So you read it and you can make of it whatever you want. But I wanted them to hear some other kinds of ways that black people thought. And so that was one of the reasons for doing it. My business in dealing with black conservatives, as I've had interactions with them and so forth over the last several years. First of all, the black conservatives that I meet are always shocked when I say I'm in a Black Studies program, because they can't believe that I'm in a Black Studies program and I would be interested in them. And I said, yes, I'm quite interested in you. And then, so that's one thing. And they're even more shocked when I tell them I'm teaching a course about black conservatives. They said, you are? And I said, yeah, I'm teaching this course. And is it a Black Studies department? Yeah, it's in the Black Studies department. But the thing was reaching out to them was that I wanted to, it was like an anthropologist in a way. I wanted to find out what it was about, why they thought the way they thought. I wanted to find out what kind of people they are. And also I wanted to know what they had. And the other thing that interested me was that, okay, here are a group of black people who are sometimes ostracized by other black people because of their political views. And so I wanted to know how it felt to them to be ostracized in certain kind of ways. And so it was interesting for me to be around people to learn these things and to figure out how they thought as black people and how they thought about themselves in relation to other black people. So that's why I did that.
This is from one of those essays, an essay called Black Conservatives Explain It All. You've got this quote.
That was meant to be funny.
I always found it valuable to listen to people I disagreed with, because that helped to clarify my own thinking as much as listening to those with whom I agreed. And the struggle of listening to someone I disagree with is a hard discipline, as if one is learning a new power, a mastery, a new dimension of one's own humanity. And I think what comes through in these essays is your ability to listen and to represent and to speak into, I mean, I can imagine black conservatives reading these essays and thinking, yes, that is in fact my view. In other words, that they would not push back against your essay, but they would recognize themselves in it, which is something I teach my own students to do. Yeah. Would your subjects recognize themselves in the way that you talk about them? You say this as well in that same essay. I am not a devotee of partisan politics and would not serve my readers well by giving them what they are already being surfeited with, vituperation and execration. Now, one of the things, and I want to transition to thinking about faith and religion in particular in relation to all this work, one of the things that came out of that was you talk about two different biblical models within black communities, especially thinking about black conservatives and others. Moses is a sort of obvious model,
yes.
Right? Leading the story of Exodus and leading the people out of slavery into the promised land. But you talk about this other model of Joseph as being a very different representation and model that is sometimes presented as an alternative for black culture to think about from the Bible of a figure for the ways that we ought to engage. So I would just wonder if you could say a quick word about the differences between Moses and Joseph and how they're used in sort of black cultural circles.
Well, Moses was, of course, the great liberator. And so, when people think about Martin Luther King, he's the Moses of his people, and he was the liberator, and he stood up against Pharaoh or Southern segregationists who were passing as Pharaoh, and this sort of thing. And that black people have always been looking for the great liberator, and that he fit that bill. Joseph was something else. Now, Joseph was a figure that Albert Murray, a leading black intellectual, argued strongly, strenuously saying, this should be the model for black people, not Moses, but Joseph. And of course, Joseph was the guy who was sold into slavery by his brothers. And he wound up rising in Egypt to become this very significant figure in Egypt and saved the Pharaoh, because he saved the Pharaoh with the famine and all this other stuff. And I can't remember all the details of the story now because it's been a little while since I wrote the essay. But what Murray wanted to convey was that the idea that black people have come to this country and we're like Joseph in a way, and we have risen up in this country and have affected the country in a way, and we should see ourselves in a different kind of way as opposed to being Moses and wanting to exit the country to be Joseph and having been part of a fabric of the country. So most black people, I think, see Moses as this kind of archetype or prototype figure, but Joseph was a very interesting one, and Albert Murray argued for it. And interestingly enough, in one of her books, I can't remember which one, Toni Morrison had this elaborate thing about Joseph as well. I can't remember which book, though. It's been a while since I've read Toni Morrison. I used to teach Toni Morrison. I can't remember. I'm an old man now. I can't remember things as well.
I wonder if we could just talk a little bit about your encounter with Moses and Joseph and where you first learned these stories and so on. Could you tell us a little bit about your own religious background, the kind of church you grew up in, and how that shaped you?
I grew up as a high church Episcopalian, and that made me an outlier where I grew up. It was very strange. I grew up in a neighborhood in Philadelphia that was, on one side of it was Italian Catholic, and the other side of it was working class black people. All my working class black friends were either Methodist or Baptist, and they didn't even know what an Episcopalian was. You know, what's an Episcopalian? And it was hard for me to tell them what it was. Just being a little kid, I don't know. It's a church. And then the Italian kids would see me coming home with my altar boy stuff, cassock and everything, and they would say, "Oh, you must be Catholic." And I said, "No, I'm not a Catholic. I'm Episcopalian." They didn't know what that was either. And but they said, "But you got this, this Catholic stuff." And I said, "Yeah, I'm an altar boy." They said, "Oh, well, you're an altar boy. You must be a Catholic." I said, "No, I'm not a Catholic." It was a funny kind of thing. But my church I grew up in was an all-black church. It was a small church, and it was a poor church, and it was mostly West Indians who were in the church, because West Indians are really Anglican. These people were like super-duper Anglican. I mean, they were more Anglican than, they were more Anglican than anything you can imagine. And my church, where I grew up, deeply affected me. I loved that church, and I thought it was a major thing in my life, going to that church and being around those people. The thing was that I felt that my black church experience, though, was missing in talking about the black church experience, because when people talk about the black church experience, they usually talk about Methodist or Baptist, gospel choirs. I didn't hear a note of gospel music. In my church, there wasn't a note of gospel music. There wasn't any of this call and response stuff. Hey, can I get an amen? No, there wasn't any of that kind of preaching in my church, but yet my church was a very black church, but it wasn't that kind of black church. And so I always felt in some way that people who had my experience got kind of cut out a little bit. But my church was very important to me.
Can you say a word about, you have been a church member all your life.
Yes.
All these essays that you've written as a church member. Can you articulate ways that your faith has affected either what you write about or the way that you write about things?
I like to say that I hope that I'm coming to everything I'm doing with some kind of a Christian perspective or understanding, even if it isn't very pronounced, that I like to think of, that I'm thinking ethically. It's very important to me to be ethical in what I'm trying to write and to be honest in what I'm trying to write. And also to not be afraid of writing something that might not be liked by a lot of people, to not be afraid of that. And I feel that I would be I would not be a good Christian. I'm not a good Christian. I'm trying to be. I guess nobody is. Who said Christianity is a wonderful thing? It's too bad nobody's tried it. I can't remember who said. Somebody said that. But in any case, to try to be convey something honest and real in the writing and something ethical in the writing, and to not be afraid. That's the biggest thing, is to not be afraid, because I think fear, I've felt a lot of fear, and I think fear is something that really cripples people. The other thing I think that really cripples people is anger and hatred. I think they really cripple people too. So I really try to go to anything I'm writing and to try to dispel that. And the hope is that anything I'm writing, when I'm writing about conservatives, whoever I've been writing about, boxing, whatever I've been writing about, is to try to bring people a little closer to some people that they thought they did not have anything in common with. And you'll discover that you have some sense of having something in common with them. So that's a very, I think, modest goal, I think.
One of the things I hear in your answer is something that I often talk about with my Christian grad students. I mentor some Christian grad students. I mentor some Christian faculty members elsewhere as well. And one of the things we talk about is, how do you engage in the work that you've been given to do, invest in the work you've been given to do, and at the same time hold it loosely as not defining the person that you are. Because at the end of the day, what you are is a child of God.
Yes.
And you're not the product of a publication.
Yes.
Or the reception of that publication. And at the same time, to care about the publication, to care about the writing, right? And one of the things I hear you saying there is, you said this from the very beginning, that essays are attempts, and if the attempt doesn't work out, you make another attempt and you move on. But to be able to hold that, all of our writings as a certain sense as essays, as attempts.
Oh, yeah.
And there's a kind of freedom to do that if you understand yourself first and foremost as a child of God.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. I hope that in the best essays I've written, and I felt that the one on the black conservatives was actually a pretty decent one, would be conveying that to people about, being a child of God. I taught a class, and I remember we had a discussion about Donald Trump, and the students were all, talking about how much they hated Donald Trump and everything. And I said, yeah, I understand that. I understand your dislike of Donald Trump and everything. But I said, just remember, God loves him too. I know you may find that hard to believe, but God loves him too. He may not love him, and
may have some issues.
Yeah, he may have some things he would like to talk to Mr. Trump about, but God loves Donald Trump too.
Yeah. I see it poking through in other ways too, and I want to just draw out your thoughts on two topics that I kind of noticed coming up. And there's a couple places where they become more explicit. And one is this quote you have, this is again from Tuxedo Junction. Mm-hmm. So, one of your first books, and I believe this is in the essay that you're writing about the beauty pageant.
Yeah.
And what you have a lot of interesting comments about what goes wrong in American culture in that essay. And one of the things you talk about is the nature of American understandings of evil. Mm-hmm. And I thought this was a kind of curious moment where some of the sort of faith, it's not an explicit moment of faith, but it's a moment where a faith understanding of evil might inflect some of the things you're writing. So I just want to read you this sentence and then ask you to sort of talk about it a minute. You say, it is, of course, a peculiarly American optimism that evil is nothing more than a series of bad habits that can, through an exercise of self-control, be broken, or at least made less compulsively excessive. The implication is this is a very wrong idea of evil.
Yes, this is a very wrong idea of evil.
Can you say a bit about what you mean and how you see it otherwise?
Yeah. Americans are very optimistic about a lot of things, and correcting evil is one of the things that Americans, I think they're optimistic about. And I think that in some respects, I kind of admire that optimism in a certain kind of way. But in another kind of way, I feel that there are certain kind of limits, and we have to understand that there are certain things out here that really are evil. And I think it's hard for people sometimes to want to face that or say that we have certain things out here that challenge us because they really are evil. I'm not going to go into delineating what they are or anything like that. I'll just leave it to people to think about it. But I think that's part of the tragedy of being a human being is the fact that we have to face evil in a certain kind of way that's very, very difficult. But that's part of our tragedy as people. And original sin, the one aspect about original sin that I liked was that it kind of made us all equal. Because we all are infected with sin, and we all are infected with being wrong. And that, when I learned about that when I was a kid, it made me feel closer to other people. Because I said, oh, this is something we haven't. We're all flawed together. That was to me that was kind of nice actually to know that we're all deeply flawed together, and so that always kind of struck me. But I've always been very taken with the idea of evil and with sin, and I feel as though Americans are too optimistic at times about things and too optimistic about what can be correct or what they even not fully understanding sin and evil. Sin's an old-fashioned term. I know nobody uses it anymore, but to me it does a lot of work. Sin describes certain kind of things. It does some good work. I know if my kids, if I said sin to my kids, they would say, "Oh, Dad, you're so." They wouldn't even say, "I'm so 20th century." "Oh, Dad, you're so 19th century," and everything. But sin is a useful word.
I have two more questions for you, and then we'll take questions from the audience. And one question again. So this essay this is about the Miss America contest, and it's about the first black winner of the Miss America contest,
yes,
and then it's about you going to see her, and the department store, which I never heard of, and which clearly no longer exists in St. Louis.
You remember that at Dolgen's? We went to see her at Dolgen's.
So it's still an incredible essay, and I believe it was one of the essays that was picked out early on and sent around as one of the best American essays.
It was. Yeah, it made the rounds.
So it's still, everyone should go read it. But in that essay, so you talk about evil, but you also talk about the nature of ambition, American ambition in particular. And I just want to read you two quotes. So I want to ask you a question about ambition. I'll ask you one final question, then we'll turn to the audience. So here's what you say about ambition. You say, in this culture, meaning America, desperation and ambition have become indistinguishable. And you say, we have debased the idea of ambition as the longing for recognition, not significant accomplishment. And I just wonder if you could unpack that. Is there a healthy form of ambition that we've lost sight of? Is all ambition a form of desperation for recognition? How do you understand ambition? And obviously you were writing about the Miss America contest when you wrote those words, but I just wonder if you think, what you think about ambition today.
Well, I think that so many things in America get so tied up with fame or being noticed in some way or the other. And I think people lose sight of being noticed for what. And I think if anything, with social media, I think actually what I wrote about there has actually been exacerbated. And it's been made worse because I actually do feel that a lot of what's on social media, a lot of the commentary, feels to me like desperation. It's getting back to Thoreau.
Yes.
Yeah, it feels like desperation. America can be, I think it can be a very desperate kind of place at times because there is so much pressure in America about succeeding, about wanting to be noticed. I think that American culture in this respect can intensify superficiality, and that troubles me a great deal because I'm an old-fashioned person, and so I want to see something with. I would like to see people wanting to be known for having achieved something and accomplished something, as opposed to just putting yourself out there. So it bothers me that there's so much superficiality, and I think that social media has kind of intensified that. Now, on the other hand, I think social media is in fact a great thing in another kind of way, insofar as how it opened up channels for people to talk and to communicate. And I think that's actually a great thing. But you know, it's like everything God gives us is sort of like it has an upside and it has a downside. And this has an upside and this has a downside. Yeah. But the Miss America contest, I don't remember that essay much at all, except I thought the Miss America contest was this kind of very, a sort of superficial thing. And part of that, I think, was a little snobbish on my part. Because Ida, I remember very well when we looked at the show, and Ida was very much a Miss America fan, and she told me I didn't appreciate, in some respects, what I was watching. And over the years, as I've thought about that, I think she was right. And so that's the other thing I gotta be careful of when I'm writing, is not to be a snob.
Yeah. The line you mentioned from Thoreau is one of the few lines that does quiet my students and get them to think a little. So the line from Thoreau that he referenced there is Thoreau has this pauses basically. So if you picture this guy who's out in basically one of these idyllic New England small towns, Concord, Massachusetts, and he looks around this town and he says, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And when I give my students that line to think about, and especially in the context of their career-driven ambitions.
Yes.
It does actually cause some conversation.
Yeah.
They still think he needs to get a job, though.
Yeah.
But
well, back in the late '60s, when he was popular, you know, he was real big with hippies and people like that, counterculture people.
Yeah. So the last question I have for you is actually just a little bit to think about this Carver project and what we're doing here. You've been not just a Christian all your life and not just an essayist all your life, but you've been a Christian at WashU for much of your life. And now, within the last 5 years, there's this community of Christian faculty at WashU. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about what your experience of being not just a scholar and a writer and an African American and a sort of founder of Black Studies at WashU, what all that has been. But what has been your experience of being a Christian at WashU, and what have you seen recently about being a Christian at WashU?
Well, I like the Carver project. It's a nice thing. Because, you know, I'm a Christian faculty person, and so it's nice to be able to find other Christian faculty people. That's been good. I've enjoyed that. I would say, on the whole, that I'm not thought very deeply about WashU in relation to my faith, except in relation to trying to do my job well. And I kind of felt that was a sort of Christian duty for me to do my job well, for me to be available to my students, for me to try to do things so that I'm not just being competent, but I'm doing something that trying to do as much as I can to exercise my job, to do my end of it with my colleagues and everything else. And all of that was partly a kind of Christian thing, because I didn't, you know, I wanted to show that respect for other people. And it was important for me to show that respect by trying to do my job well. And I felt that came out of my upbringing as an Episcopalian.
Shelley?
the first couple of questions go together. And what is the place of the essay in a culture of short attention spans? And who are some of the best younger essayists today? I put two together. They're related.
Well, you know, I mean, it is a short attention span, it's true. But essays are very elastic, they're very expandable. You can make them shorter or longer as you wish. And I mean, I'm not that good at that, but you should be able to write, you should be able to write an essay of 200 words or something, and that should work for people.
I just read a bunch of your essays, and they're not that short.
No, they're not that short. And so, and I think I told you, oh, these are short ones.
Yeah, I think you did.
And everything. But in the world of attention spans going lesser, I think the biggest thing is that people are easily distracted. And I think that's the fight about attention, is that people are easily distracted. So it is my job, if I'm writing something to you, is to focus your mind. And if I write well enough, I feel that I can focus your mind on it. I think that's what anybody has to do these days insofar as attracting people's attention. You're not going to change anything by wishing we were back in the 19th century, wishing we were reading, wouldn't it be nice if we all were sitting around reading Russian novels and stuff like that. Young essayists. Oh, man.
I can name a couple from our department.
Who'd you have in mind?
Edward McPherson, Gerald.
Oh, yeah, Ed McPherson. Yeah, he's a great essayist. I'm glad you mentioned him, you know, because he really is, he's really
good. This is just me touting the program, the English department.
But he really is.
We are fantastic if you'd like to come to an MFA.
Yeah, he's really good. And a long time ago, he wrote something for me for this journal I edit called The Common Reader, and he's really good essayist. I would really recommend him. I don't know. There are a lot of people I read. I don't know if I can remember people's names or recommend them to you. I read a lot of people. Let's see. I just would stick with Edward McPherson right now. If I think about some other people before this is over, I'll tell you.
Great. Okay, the next couple of questions have to do with baseball. I've heard it said that baseball is the most literary sport. Do you think that's true? Do you see sports in general as literary? And then I'm going to pair this question with another, which has to do with how you became involved with Ken Burns and the baseball documentary and what that experience was like.
So just for context, for those who don't know, he's been on 6 now different Ken Burns documentaries.
Yeah, I was on 6 different Ken Burns.
So many interviews and hours with Ken Burns.
Yeah, I've hung out with Ken a lot. Ken asked me to do the baseball thing, which was when I first got to know him. I wrote an essay on Jackie Robinson that appeared in a book that Ken's writer, Jeff Ward, was in the book also, and he read the essay, and he gave it to Ken, and Ken liked the essay, and so Ken called me, and this is right after the Civil War, and so, you know, he's become a real big name, and he says, you know, I'm Ken Burns and blah, blah, and at first I wasn't quite sure if it was, I said, Ken Burns, why would Ken Burns be calling me? And he said, I'm doing this baseball documentary and I want you to be in it. And, well, I want you to be a consultant. At that time, it wasn't determined I was going to be in it. And I said, oh, well, you know, I'm really not the baseball expert that you want. And I started naming people. Oh, you need to get Bill James, you need to get Roger Angel, and you need to get people like that, you know, Charles Alexander. You need to get people like that. Those are the people you need to get. And he said to me, oh, I got all those people. And so now I want you. And I said, oh, okay. So that's how I first got to meet Ken Burns, and that started our relationship. The other thing about literary, yeah, I think baseball's very literary. I think it's more literary. I think the only other sport that is, I feel, as literary as baseball is, but not in this country, would be soccer. But I feel that baseball is, in this country, a very, very literary sport.
What do you mean by that?
I think there's been more poetry, more novels written about baseball than any sport I can think about. And I think more good writers have written about baseball than any other sport. That's not to say some good writers haven't written about some other sports, but I think baseball is a sport that they've written about more than any other. I've been asked several times if I would teach a course on the literature of baseball at WashU. I've always said no, but it would be very easy to teach such a course.
Where does the interest in boxing come from?
I grew up in a working class neighborhood, and 3 of the kids that I went to school with in that neighborhood became professional boxers. And so there was a lot of just boxing generally in the culture. And so that's how I got interested in it as a result of that. And I don't necessarily know if I liked it, but I know that the men around me and the boys around me liked it, and it was important for me to partake. It was important in communicating with them to have an interest in it.
You told me a funny story of taking Ida to a boxing match.
And that didn't turn out well. That was
As I recall, Ida's line was, they really hit each other hard.
Yeah, that was not one of my better. That was not one of our better dates.
I got a quick follow-up, if you don't mind, on these sports questions, which is how do you write about the sport as such, and do you try to think about the sport in relation to some broader thing that you want to talk about? So I have in mind, for example, when you talk about prize fighting, you wrote, modern prize fighting is a remarkable metaphor for the philosophical and social condition of people in modern mass society. So in this essay, which is one of your essays from Culture of Bruising, it's boxing you want to talk about, but you want to talk about boxing and the black intellectual, like the boxing and something else. So how do you know when you want to write about the sport as such, and how do you know how do you think about the sport in relation to something else?
I never want to write about the sport as such. I'm always thinking about writing about it as expressing something else. The sport as a sport, it doesn't interest me to write about it that much. And the reason why I'm not trying to be a snob or anything is because there are other people out there who I admire terrifically who can write about the sport as sport much better than I can. But I can, I want to try to say something else, and the sport is useful for me to try to say something else. So that's why I go to the sport to do that. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't.
Essays.
Yes, essays.
Okay, the next question. There's a perception that higher ed is quick to cancel tenured folks who present with what some may see as controversial views. You mentioned being okay with readers disagreeing with your work. How do you navigate that within the confines of your role at WashU?
I don't know. I mean, I just kind of do what I do. I don't worry too much about what people will say. I don't know if I'm a good example right now because I've worked at the school for 41 years. And so I've gotten a kind of stature, I guess. And so people, either stature or just people just totally ignore me and say, oh, well, let that old guy just do whatever he wants. I guess there is canceling that goes on. I've never experienced it myself. I've always found my colleagues to be pretty reasonable people, by and large. But the unreasonable people work at other schools.
Just a couple more questions, maybe?
Sure.
You mentioned being at WashU for 41 years, which I think is your entire academic career.
Yeah, that's it. Unless I had another life. This one has been this.
Can you talk a bit about what it means to have invested your professional career in one spot, and maybe a bit about WashU's growth or evolution in this sort of couple of decades?
Yeah, well, I think that I decided to stay at WashU. There were some personal reasons involving my wife and everything. That was part of it. But I decided also I wanted to stay because I wanted to really dig deep in one institution and learn this institution and have some sense of a presence and influence at a particular institution. And I felt that if I hopped around to a bunch of institutions, that would dilute the impact I could have. But if I stayed at one place for a real long time, then I could have more of an impact. You know, if you stay at one place, I stay at an institution long enough, you become an institution too. You know, I think that was it. And Washington University, Washington University, when I came here, as I told Ida, I said, Washington University is a stock that's going up. And, you know, I want to be with it when it rises, because it's a stock that's going up. I came in 1982, and I think I was right. It was a stock that definitely went up.
Maybe one last question. Since you've been at a university for a while,
yeah.
If you were putting together a core series of required courses for students, what would those be?
Can you write our new strategic plans curriculum? Just right now.
If I were putting together a curriculum?
Core courses.
Core courses. Oh, I don't know. It's impossible for me to say. I mean, it's impossible for me to say because every day I have some different idea what some core courses might be, and so I really couldn't say. I guess if I were going to teach one core course, because I'm an Americanist, and I've always been an Americanist. I've always been rooted in understanding America, and that's been me. And you got to understand that may sound a little provincial now, but I'm a Cold War baby. I mean, I grew up during the Cold War, and so that means a lot to me, growing up during the Cold War, about America. And I wanted to understand America in a certain kind of way. So if I was going to teach some kind of a core course, I mean, I would say, okay, what I would teach would be America. And or the United States of America, okay? Because you know, I have some of my more left-wing colleagues don't like me calling it just America. So the United States of America, and you know, I would want to, if I had such a course, I would want to have a collection of students, and I would want to have them for an entire year, and I would want to take them on some field trips, and I want them to try to experience as broadly as possible what this country is. This is a wonderful country. People have asked me, I tell people all the time, I say, I love this country. I don't always like this country, but I love this country. But sometimes it's hard to like it. But I think that's, if I was thinking about a course right now, that's what I do. Something like that. I've always kind of thought about wanting to do some kind of course like that. The other thing I thought about doing a course on was Philadelphia, which is my hometown.
That's great. Well, I just want to thank you all for being here. This is a first of our faculty forums, and just to give you a sense, so I just want you, this is a plug for Gerald's work. If you haven't read it yet, you can look at Google this journal called The Common Reader, which Gerald has been editing for many years. It comes out from WashU, and a lot of Gerald's writings come up in Common Reader. You got material there?
Yeah, this is the part where I give you what I have.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So Common Reader is a great way to read essays as they come out. I mean, one of your great recent essays was a review of the Black Panther sequel.
Yeah.
Which I think got a lot of pushback.
It got some. It got some. But then there were people who secretly, I mean, there were people, because I didn't give it a good review, and there were people who who kind of snarled at it. But then there were people who told me privately, yeah, I kind of agree with that review. I don't think the movie was that good. So, you know, I think it was cool. But
So
at any rate,
this is a way to read some of Gerald's stuff as it continues to come out. And I just want to read this one quote from Tuxedo Junction back in the day, which I think still is true, is that you say the thematic relatedness of all of your essays lies in the insistent strain of speaking about African American culture within the wider context of American intellectual and highbrow culture and American popular culture. So this idea that it's not just African American culture or pop culture or high culture, but that all of these things relate to one another.
yeah,
And the way to understand one is to see it in the context of the others.
yeah, that's I wrote that?
You did?
Oh.
About 40 years ago.
Yeah, I was smarter then. But I wanted to give you and Shelley, this is some swag from the Common Reader.
Look at this. Very nice.
And a Common Reader shirt.
There you go. There you go. This is awesome. I did not realize this was coming.
And a Common Reader cap.
Oh, yes. Now we're talking.
And I had this for you too, Shelley.
Okay, I'll take it.
All right.
Thank you so much. That's great.
And
Yes,
I
that's
got
right.
something for people in the audience. I can't give
Can we
all
shoot it
y'all
out
this,
of a cannon? Do you have a t-shirt cannon?
but I got bookmarks.
There
I'm
you
going to
go.
give all of y'all a bookmark from the Common.
Whoop. That's our call. So we got bookmarks to hand out, and we got cookies at the reception. So, you know, I just want to thank you all for being here, and if we could all thank Gerald.
Please do join us for some cookies, and our next public event is Friday, December 8th. It will be called Sing a New Song, Poetry and Faith, and we'll be talking with two Christian poets, Marilyn Nelson and Christian Wyman. That'll be at St. Peter's Episcopal Church. This fall we are Episcopal. Thanks for coming.
Thanks, everyone.